procedures that have to be developed. We've got our staff to train. And then, of course, all the documentation that goes along with both of those things. And then, of course, the security, which we're still hearing so much in the media. And, of course, with all the breaches and the different fines that are coming out of all these breaches. All of this is still up in the air for a lot of practices. We want to make sure that you've got the information that you need and that you're working towards becoming compliant. The whole atmosphere has changed. It's created new work for us. ObamaCare, when it went into effect, most offices, most doctors did not realize that it was going to affect how they practiced in the actual day-to-day practicing. Everybody was afraid of what's going to happen with the exchanges, the insurance coverage, and things like that. But actually, ObamaCare impacts on our practicing much more than any other legislation ever has. So there's lots of new work we have to do. It's a whole new environment in Washington. The way they decide who to do the audits on has changed. The way the audit has changed. All the different agencies are working together. It's just a whole new idea with what's going on, and it's put all kinds of new responsibilities onto the doctor. It doesn't matter what size practice that you are in. Everybody has the new responsibilities. And, so what we're going to be doing is just talking about welcome to the new way to practice in the 21st century in America. It really has changed. So what we're going to do today is kind of familiarize you with what your requirements are, to help you explore what you've already done. Hopefully you're working on this on a regular basis. And if you haven't, help you develop a plan of what you need to do. It's something that, does take time, and it's just not something you're going to do on a one weekend. The new requirements have, affected us with how we send information, how we document our information. The whole atmosphere within the office has changed because of these new requirements. And with these new requirements, you basically have to have written policies and procedures and all these different manuals to make sure that you're hitting all the requirements. We have to have operations policies and procedures to make sure that you're doing the proper thing when you're sending out emails with patient information. You've got, of course, all the different compliance things to your privacy practices, all the information that you have to give to your patients, and all the things they have to sign off on. Then your human resources, all the different things we have to do with our staff, including the training, the documenting the training. What we're seeing is when there are audits going on because of President Obama's edict that all the agencies work together, we're seeing as many as 5 agencies going into an office to do an audit. And so if you're out of compliance with the OSHA regulations, you don't have a good safety manual, that can get you into a lot of trouble. And of course, we've all had HIPAA manuals for a long time now, but we're still seeing that a lot of offices really aren't following through what's in their own manuals. But all of these different things now are something that has to be done in our office. It takes time. Whenever you're training an employee, the idea is, the research has shown that, it takes 2 or 3 years for a new employee to really, get up to speed with what's going on. Well, for us old-timers, been in practice for a long time, it's going to take us a few years to get used to it as well and get all the training down. Again, it takes time, so if you haven't started, please get started as soon as possible.
Okay, Don, I have to chime in.
What we're going to go over is today. Sure.
Don, I have to chime in because I feel like you're calling me an old-timer, even though I guess I am, having been in this profession for 30-something years. But one point that I have to make here is that I didn't get at the beginning that I've really gotten now, that it's not that big of a deal. It's just doing things in a certain way that the government wants us to do. That's why it's not a tomorrow thing, and it's not, okay, I bought this and I'm compliant. And the point you made about logs and training, it's like having your staff trained is one thing, but if you haven't documented what you've trained them in, then it doesn't exist. Just like once upon a time, soap notes, people didn't have to document well, and they just had a travel card that said they did everything. Now you have to write down what you did, and similarly, they're making the same concepts apply to how your practice is run, how your staff is run, documenting who knows what and how. And this is why developing effective manuals systematically while it seems like it's a lot of work, once you start doing it, it becomes process. But creating that process that may take 2 or 3 years to become fully implemented is what the trick is. Would you agree?
Oh yeah, definitely. A lot of the stuff that's in our new manuals and all are just basically things we probably have done in our practices in the past, but we just never wrote it down. We never put it into a formal procedure. We never adopted it in a formal manner. We've done it. We were careful about security. We were careful about different things, but we just didn't take the time to put it into writing. And like you said, now it's not just like with our notes, you document, document, document. Now it's for everything we do in our office. The logs, the training, all of the walkthroughs for security, all these different things now have to be documented. We're going to go into that in a little bit more here in a moment. So, all of these policies and procedures that we have to write, they actually have said in the legislation that they want these to be concise and easily understood. And the OIG has gone even further to, make sure that we know that in these policies and procedures that we write, that it defines the processes, what has to be done. It details the procedures, when, where, and then, of course, it denotes the responsibility for who is responsible for doing it. And this is the type of thing that we need to have in each one of our policies and procedures. They want to be able to walk in, pick up our policy and procedure manual, and see what all these different things are being done in the office and who's responsible for it. So, here's an example of what they really want us to do. This policy and procedure is written in this manner will actually protect you in court. Because what it does is it sets up in very strict language of what should be done. And if something's not being done by that procedure, or the staff does something that they're not authorized to do, well, then you've got written documentation to say, hey, they were not supposed to do that. And so you need to have a title. And for this one, I just put policy and procedure format. You need to have it approved by. For each of your policies, or you can do your whole policy and procedure manual at one time, but then it becomes confusing when you add in new policies and procedures later. It's actually better just to adopt each one and approve each one as you put them in your manual. And that way you can see that if something happened in, let's say, December of 2012, well, this policy and procedure wasn't in place, and so, it doesn't really apply to there. What we've seen, too, is that even the feds and the auditors are taking this into consideration. So let's say you find out in this webinar today that you're doing something you're not supposed to. So you put in a new policy and procedure, you date it, you adopt it, and then let's say 3 months from now, the OIG walks in and has a full audit on your office. But you could show that on today's date, you approved this new policy and that you're trying your best, you're doing your due diligence, then they will take that into consideration. And typically, they have really lowered the fines. We've seen this over and over, that if you're trying, they'll lower the fines. They still may try to recoup all of the money if there's money they can recoup. But the fines they've been reducing if you can show that as of this date, we found out we were doing something wrong and we changed it. That's what they want to see. They want to see in the documentation that you are working to be compliant, that you're working to make sure there's no fraud going on, that everything is being done above board and by the regulations. So the adoption date really has saved a lot of doctors money from these audits because they could show that on this specific date they adopted the new policy, and so since that date they've been doing it the correct way. So this is the formal format that every policy and procedure should be in, and including the adopted date, which is so important with these audits. So, they're written for your protection. These type of policies and procedures will stand up in court. The old handbooks, the employee handbooks, really were written in such informal language that they wouldn't stand up in court because it wasn't, adopted by a specific person on a specific date, etc. But these that are written in the formal format do really stand up and protect you in court. It's basically just part of best practices now within business to do these type of things. And, it improves your overall operations. And, of course, when you have improved operations, that should, in turn, improve your bottom line. So we're all interested in that. There are certain elements within the compliance program that, that they've actually stated very, very clearly that they want us to have standards of conduct for our employees, okay? And as part of that, is our commitment to comply with all the statutory, regulatory, and Medicare program requirements. They put that specifically in there, that they want that, code of conduct is actually in our policy and procedure manual. And of course, they've said they want to be written, and there's certain specific points they want to make sure that we've done. So, with these next few points, if you haven't done these yet, be sure you go ahead and do it as soon as possible, because these are some of the things they're going to look for first. Appointing a compliance officer, having a list of duties. So you need to have, a memo in your compliance officer's personnel file that they were appointed on this date to be the compliance officer, and you need to have all the duties listed that comes with that responsibility. You want to be able to show that you're reviewing all of your compliance policies on an annual basis. Well, hopefully you put these in place last year, and sometime since then now you've gone back and reviewed them and documented that. The log of inquiries is one of the things they really want to see, because that shows who is requesting information coming out of your office, where you send it, things like that. So they're very, very interested in what we do with that patient, protected patient information, and they want to know where it's been sent and who requested it. Of course, we just mentioned training and the documentation. That not only do you have to do the really good job of training, but you have to document it. There was the dermatology group there in the Northeast that got hit with $250,000 fine, and primarily the reason they were hit with the fine was because they could not prove that they had trained their staff in when a breach occurred, what to do, if there was a breach, what they had to do the investigation. It was all basically due to the fact they didn't have the documentation to back up that they had trained their staff. The breach really, none of the information that was breached was actually used. It was just that because they did not have the documentation to prove that they were doing what they were supposed to do, they had a $250,000 fine.
Whoa! So they had to pay
We need to have specific lines.
They had to pay $250,000 because they didn't have a manual?
Well, because they didn't have a training log showing what they had trained their staff in, and showing that they had trained their staff, how to, the security that was needed, and what to do if there was a breach, who was responsible, that type of thing. They just didn't have it all in writing. And so, they used that and for $250,000 fine. So they're playing serious, folks. Okay, lines of communications, you need to have that in writing too, so your staff knows who to report to. Of course, their self-audits and their corrective action plans we have to be doing, and of course your record retentions. All those things are different, very important program elements. They're coming down really hard on kickbacks and inducements. There's nothing new on that. They're just catching more now than they used to, because they're doing so much more auditing. Disciplinary guidelines. You have to have in your policies and procedures disciplinary guidelines that cover every person on your staff, including the doctor, including the owner, including the clinic director. They want to see that if the doctor screws up and does something wrong, that there's consequences. Now, the consequences may be to receive more training, etc., but there's supposed to be, for every person that has responsibility towards the protected health information, if that is not being done appropriately, there is supposed to be some sort of disciplinary action for them. It has to be in writing. Documentation, so important. You need to have written guidelines for each of your payer types so you can train your staff easier and make it easier for the staff to figure out how to do their jobs. There's government reporting involved with the breaches and things like that. So these are all elements that they have pinpointed that they want specific information on. So that all goes into your written policies and procedures. Let's talk a little bit about staff training. I've got a lot of information here I want to go through pretty quick today, so hang on. Staff training, it has to be ongoing. You can't just say something one time and expect that to cover it. And one of the things that we've seen, and I've seen this when some of the audits that I've done, that a doctor will do really good training once a year. They'll hire experts to come in and give really detailed training, but once a year. So what happens if it's 3 months after that training and they hire a new person? That new person doesn't know anything that happened in that training, and it'll be 9 months before they have the new training. And so for that 9 months, that staff person is really untrained, doesn't understand, what has to be done, and we're seeing that that does cause problems. So the feds have said that they really want the staff to receive specific security training on their first day of employment. Your staff, the first day you hire them, should know by the time they leave what the security measures are. What they can do on the internet, what they can't do on the internet, the passwords, all these different details that your new staff need to know, and they need to know at the first day. You can't wait 6 months, 3 months until the professionals come around. There has to be some training at the very beginning on the security. The whole idea is to create an atmosphere of compliance, and that's their term, that they want the whole office working towards making sure everything is done above board by the regulations within the timelines required. Everything is compliant. That's what they want. And to prove that we're doing our part on that, we have to document everything. It's not just our SOAP notes where documentation is so important now. It's in all these different areas. So that gives you a rough idea of the staff training. Now, documentation. Let's hit some of the high points of the documentation. It's logs, logs, and more logs. I believe it's 12 or 13 logs now that we have to have. The inquiry log is one of the first ones that they look for, and the compliance training log is the next. And then your transmission log, whenever you send out protected health information, they want to know, how it was sent, where it was sent to, things like that. And then, of course, you've got to be able to come up with all of your annual audit logs to show that you're doing your self-audits that are necessary. And then if there is a corrective action plan, make sure that's documented, that you are working on it or you have completed it. And if you completed it, make sure you date and sign off when it was completed. Again, document, document, document is so important. Your staff training log we talked about. Not only do you do a staff-wide training log, but you also need to have an individual employee training log in their files, in their personnel files, so that you can see and show an auditor, what this particular individual, what their training was, because, let's say your x-ray tech may need different training than your front desk person. Well, both of them need specific training, and if you were just using a staff-wide training log, it wouldn't show who received the individual training that they need for their position. So that's why they want to have both. Your safety training log. OSHA, doesn't require us to report that we're doing the training, but they require that we log that we're doing the training, and then we log what we're training our staff on when it comes to safety. So, they want us to be doing ongoing training on an annual basis for safety reasons, and so you have to have a training log for that. You also have to have a log for your safety review. And we combine safety and security in most of our reviews like that, so we can look, when we're going around the office and looking at how things are set up, we're paying attention not only just to the security of it, but also the safety of it, and then we can go into our logs. They prefer, if you're doing x-rays, that you do a daily log, so if there's any questions, you can always go back and confirm. Again, it's just more and more documentation, but this accurate records really does allow for smoother operations. I know in my office manager just shook her head when she saw how big the operating manual was compared to our old one. But I told her, a lot of the things that we wrote down, we had been doing before. We just didn't have it in writing, and that some of these would really save errors and save problems. And she agrees now most of it does. It's taken us, about a year to get all this to be satisfied, but I think she's pretty satisfied with how everything is going right now. There we go. So that's documentation. And your security, they want us to make sure we have tighter control of access, of who has access to the records, who has access to your office, etc. So that means having a key log, a log of whoever has the key, whoever has the passcode to get in through your security systems, all that type of thing. You need to keep it logged. You need to make sure that you've got policies that says who has access to what. And so, they want to make sure that, if things need to be locked up, then they get locked up before the cleaning staff comes in, things like that. They want, simple, straightforward, basic security, but, they need to have those in writing as well. I'm sure you've heard over and over about the passwords and how they, are looking at making sure you have a long password to get into your database. You want a 20 or 22 letter password for accessing the protected health information. They really are playing serious about that. They want to also know, how soon after a person leaves employment do you turn off their password, and that you have written policies for that. So if you terminate somebody, they want you to be terminating that password too within a short amount of time. They don't want you to leave that password dangling out there for that person to sign back in from home or whatever and cause problems. So you need to have written policies on that as well. The fines have been raised on these type of policies when there's problems with this too. It used to be most of the fines were around $25,000. That's high, but now they start at $150,000 and go up. So they're playing serious, folks. We've got to take this and do this appropriately. So if you have a breach, and we're going to talk about that in a second, you've got to have written protocols as part of your Social Security, so that you have an investigation and says where the breach was, how it happened, was it accidental, was it intentional, things like that. Who does the determination of the level of the breach, how many patient files were involved, how many patients were involved, things like that. Then of course there's the procedures you have to have for your mandatory notifications. You have to mandatory notification for not only HHS or CMS, but for your patients as well. So all of these have to be in writing, and then you also have to have written corrective action plans whenever there's a problem.
Dr. Cross, if you could back up one slide for a second. When a lot of these things that I hear, and I know a lot of people that I'm seeing some questions on the board right now. If you have any questions, please ask. We'll get to the questions at the end. But a lot of people ask questions like, at this point, people are like, what the heck? They don't have no idea what's going on. A lot of this stuff, there's buzzwords that make it sound more complicated than it is. Basically, what this means is you need to think about ahead of time. If something happens, how to react, what's the intelligent way to react, and who's responsible, and just have it written down in a place that you can point to it, that people have and the team have read, which is really only common sense. The problem is putting it all together, and that's what the challenge is, and that's why having some kind of a manual set up does make sense. But this is all, when you think about it, not anything new. It's just requiring people to use the common sense that they should have been using all along.
Correct. And like you said, so much of what this is things that our staff knew to do, but we just never wrote it down and put it in an organized manner. But then there are the new things like the mandatory notifications for whenever you have a breach. But a lot of common sense in some of this stuff. Some of it's overkill in my opinion, but a lot of common sense as well. Breaches, I'm just going to talk because we could talk 2 hours on breaches, but let's just talk, there's a couple minutes left on breaches. If there's under 10 patient files involved, 10 patients, then you basically can just take care of it and write letters. There's a specific letter you have to send out to all the patients. If you have more than 10 but under 500, you've got to put things on your website. You've got to put things in the newspaper. And there's different requirements for each of those levels. Under 500, then you can report it at the end of the year to HHS. If it's over 500, you've got 60 days before you to notify them. So all of these different levels have to have their own procedures. You should have them all written ahead of time. Same thing for the letters that go out to the patients, the letters that go out to HHS. And remember, you're mandated to put this up on your website if you've had something like this happen, so that everybody that visits your website sees this. So this is not something that you can take lightly. I mean, you don't want this to happen because it can really ruin your practice. So be very, very careful about the breaches. Make sure you've got all these procedures in place, and make sure your staff understand. And then, of course, nowadays, you've got to have an attestation from your staff saying that they've been trained in what to do. It can't just be that you wrote it out in the staff log. They actually have to attest in writing that they have the training. It's the safest way to go to make sure that you can prove to the auditors that you've done your due diligence. So we're coming right up on 1:30. Is there any questions? Steve, you still there?
Yes, I'm still here. My apology. One question that came in was, is it okay to email patient records? Is it okay to email a patient about their appointment? Can you talk? Can you talk about email?
Sure. Excuse me. Common sense. Okay, that's sort of the common sense is the most basic guideline for this. If you're just emailing a patient about their appointment, okay, you really don't have to worry too much about encrypting that. But if you're going to send an attorney patient records or a final report or something along that line, definitely needs to be encrypted before it leaves your computer. Okay. Now, your patient can give you permission to actually email them their information, but you have to have their permission to do it unencrypted. Okay. So in our office, it's just simpler and easier that everything that we email out that has patient information goes out encrypted. That way we don't have to have a written permission letter signed by the patient. We don't have to go to all that trouble with patient information. But anytime patient information is being sent to a third party, then yes, you need to make sure that it's encrypted before you send it out. Like I said, ours is just the simplest, just to do it everything, and that way you don't get into trouble.
Okay, cool. Cool. Any other questions before we go forward? What do I need to do? And obviously, with anything, there's a service that can be offered. And I want to make this point: this is not. You don't have to use OCCM. For those of you that are in our CPAP program that are focusing the practice on posture, please understand that if you want to do this stuff yourself, you totally can. And I know that we've been keeping you busy, especially with the recent things. And if you haven't seen it, this month, Shape Magazine and Real Simple Magazine both quoted us, and some of them used the Posture Zone app. So we're very happy with the mainstream media attention we're getting. This is not something that you have to do today with the OCCM, but you do need to be paying attention to this stuff. So if you want to do it yourself, that's going to take longer. If you want a faster way to do it, CHIROONESOURCE and Randy has to me a much better solution for it, which is a manual. Randy, you want to talk about that?
Well, yeah, I appreciate that, Dr. Weiniger. I've assisted a number of practices implementing this program, and my background is consulting, and I'm always concerned about how do you implement a project like this, because it could be a great program, but if you cannot get it implemented, it's not worth anything. In this case, they've done a great job of making this easy to implement and to follow through on over time. And so I've honestly can tell you, and as Dr. Weiniger said, you could go and research this, do it yourself. There's nothing wrong with that. I personally think it would be a large task, and I wouldn't want to do it myself, but this program can be customized to your practice. And again, I've gone through it, and we've gotten it implemented in one case in 30 days. That was the fastest one, I will tell you that. But the important thing is that you get started. You really need to get started with this immediately so that you can show an auditor that you're moving forward. And again, I can assist someone. Call that 800 number if you want to learn more about the program and whether or not you may or may not need my assistance in getting it implemented. And in fact, this slide really shows the 4 options that you have. You can do nothing, which obviously we don't recommend. Many of the resources for this are on the website.
That's the ObamaCare compliance manual website, by the way.
Yeah, and so you could go again and learn how to do it yourself. You can purchase the program. implement it with your own team, and then finally, purchase the program, and I will lead, your practice through the process, and it is painless, but you need to do it. You need to put some energy into it. Any other questions that you had there, Dr. Weiniger?
Basically, the question was, will the PowerPoint slides be available afterwards? And they should be. And if you're on this, you'll get an email about it. One question was about whether or not it applies to them because they don't do Medicare. And the answer to that is, I pretty much answered them, is that it applies to everybody in practice. It's pretty much something that you'd like to think doesn't apply to you. Unfortunately, it does. And you're not going to be the first person they come looking at, but when they do, you'll have not been doing it right for a longer period of time. So it kind of makes sense to kind of start doing it sooner. The options that are basically the OCCM manual process. It also includes other things besides the HIPAA compliance, because there's people talking about HIPAA compliance packages that are $700, $800, and I would not have recommended something like that to our people. I do recommend ObamaCare because it also includes all of the government manuals that you need. You need to have something for OSHA from a safety point of view. You need something for human resources from a hiring point of view. You need facility programs. You need basic forms for the office, like all these different forms are the newer style PDF forms that you can fill in electronically instead of having to scan and then save separately. You can keep it all electronically if you have an EHR. If you want help putting it together, I can't recommend Randy highly enough. Basically, Randy's spreadsheet is for $250, $249. He'll walk your team through it. It makes it less time, less effort internally. You know that you're doing the right thing with not heavy duty investment of, like I saw one company that was like $4,000 to walk people through things. And he'll also give you a hand with initial consulting, which is the way that both CHIROON services and Body Zone and Posture Practice talk about things, doing things the smart way, the right way, helping people and helping them from our point of view stand tall and move well. From Dr. Corsa's point of view, helping them practice smart so they can keep on staying in practice and keep on helping people.
All right, perfect. Well, I hope everyone's found this informative. Again, you have the numbers and the et cetera to contact with questions. And I want to thank Dr. Cross and Dr. Weiniger for sharing their knowledge, and especially the fact that you guys have built this program, which I think will enable so many more practices to be compliant than would be possible without it. And so you guys have done a great job, and I certainly appreciate the fact that you've invested this time.
Randy, thank you very much for having us. Don, thank you very much for all your work putting this together and helping people practice smart.
Thanks everyone for attending, and we will hopefully talk to you soon. Have a great day.